I'm going to get started right now. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to Friday morning Q&A, COVID coping number 7. I really love seeing everybody on these calls. It has been almost exactly 3 months since we had our last Friday morning Q&A together. So I'm going to present some of the latest guidance and updates. There have been a lot of clarifications since our last session together. Towards the end, you can unmute yourselves and or put your questions in the chat box, and I will answer everyone's questions toward the end. There is quite a bit of information, and so I'll go through the presentation. If you could wait to unmute yourselves to the end, again, that would be very, very helpful for those watching our recording. So just to get started this morning, our objective for today is really to answer your questions and be a resource for individuals who are self-employed and for business owners. So today, the main things we're going to be covering are how to apply for the PPP loan forgiveness, what you should do if you don't obtain forgiveness, and then I'm going to go through some other relief and updates. So 3 months ago, we had our last session. So May 8th, we were all together on a Friday. So as of August 8th, more than 5 million businesses received funding of the PPP loan, which totaled over $525 billion. So if you are one of those who received funds, congratulations. I know it's really been helpful for a lot of people. If you didn't receive that funding, then there are some other options available, and I can go through a couple of those as well. So the SBA just opened their forgiveness portal this week, so we are very timely with this presentation. Just because the portal is open doesn't mean that you should necessarily run out and apply for forgiveness yet, and I'll tell you why during this presentation. Further guidance will be forthcoming. I know I put may be forthcoming, but I assure you there will be additional guidance coming up. So the Paycheck Protection Program forgiveness, I'm going to go over some basic FAQs to start. So sole proprietors and other business entities, so S corporations, partnerships, etc., will be using SBA forms 3508. And if you are a sole proprietor, you will, and you don't pay wages to other employees, you'll be using the 3508 Easy. It's a really easy form. You'll be really surprised. They've clarified the guidance for how sole proprietors, self-employed individuals apply. It looked like it was going to be really tricky and difficult to obtain forgiveness, but right now it's looking like most sole proprietors will have their loans forgiven in full. They have also clarified that you won't have to mail in documents, rather they will be accepting scanned copies of documentation, and that e-signatures will be accepted. So that's a huge win for businesses, that you don't have to actually print and mail everything out. You do have 10 months from the date of the completion of your covered period to submit your loan application for forgiveness. So you have time to gather all your documentation and to submit this application. So like I said, even though the portal opened this week for forgiveness, that doesn't mean you should run out there and apply for forgiveness. And so as you may know, there originally was an 8-week period, which is considered the covered period. And those dates are very important. So that 8-week period is 56 days from the day you received funding, or the 24 weeks is 168 days. So you may want to count out on the calendar to know exactly what your covered period is. So if you have, if you received funding for your PPP before June 5th, the 8-week period applies to you, or the 24-week period. You can choose either of the two to be your covered period. If you've received your loan after June 5th, then the 24-week period is the only period that applies to you. So keep in mind that your covered period, so if you got your PPP loan later in the year, it may not extend beyond December 31st. So that is a limit that would apply to you if you got your loan, let's say just this last week, which some clients of mine did. One of the other clarifications have to do with expenses incurred or paid, and I'll go over that in a minute. That's a really big win for us. And then they also clarified that owner compensation is capped at $20,833. I know that that was a question back in May, if you were able to get W-2 wages and health insurance and retirement plan over and above that $20,833. So they have clarified that as well. So I'll go into that in a minute too. So the Paycheck Protection Program is a loan, as you know, if it is not forgiven. So keep in mind that loans have terms, and what that basically means for the PPP loan is this will apply to any portion of your loan that is not forgiven. So you need to keep in mind what was the exact date that the funds were deposited into your business bank account or your bank account, because the loan terms will depend on when you received your PPP loan. Payments on your loan will be deferred for 6 months. So I'm sure you remember when exactly the funds were deposited, because we all had a little celebration in our offices when we got the money. So count out those 6 months. You will not be responsible for any payments on that loan for 6 months. On any portion of the loan that is not forgiven, the interest rate will be fixed at 1%. And the interest has already begun accruing, and the interest is going to be accrued only on the portion of the loan that's not forgiven. If you end up prepaying any of the loan back, there are no prepayment penalties. So clearly, I mean, 1% is really low, so you may just want to keep that loan in place. Do keep in mind that the full amount of the loan that is not forgiven will be due in 2 years. If you received your funds before June 5th, if you received your funds after June 5th, then you have 5 years to pay back the full balance. So what they've been talking about is if you did receive funds before June 5th and you can't pay the loan back in 2 years, you may elect to pay it back in 5 years. I don't know yet how to do that, but that election will be available. So in order to achieve forgiveness, these are the same rules for the most part that we talked about back in May. The loan amounts will be forgiven as long as you're using or used your loan proceeds to cover your payroll costs. And I'll talk about what specifically payroll costs are in a minute. You need to use at least 60% of your loan to cover those. And then less than 40% could go to mortgage interest, rent, or utility costs. Now, the thing that has changed is prior to that, one of the rules was the 60% payroll. The other was to maintain full-time employee equivalents, and there is a safe harbor for that at this point. So you don't necessarily have to rehire all of your employees in order to achieve forgiveness. We'll talk about that in a moment, but compensation levels must be maintained, and that is the third rule. So let's talk about eligible expenses for the PPP. So your payroll costs do include benefits for some businesses, but not all. And I'll talk about which businesses those apply to in just one moment. Interest on any mortgage obligations. So we're not talking credit cards. We're talking about if you own a building, the interest that you pay on your mortgage, as long as that loan was in place before February 15th of 2020. Same thing applies for rent expense. If you had lease agreement in place before February 15th, that also qualifies you for the forgiveness. Same thing for utilities. If service began before February 15th of 2020, those utility bills also will qualify for forgiveness. So as you know, and this has not changed since May, salary, wages, commissions and tips are capped at $100,000 per individual on an annualized basis. That's where that $20,000 figure comes in, the $20,833 that I just mentioned. Costs for vacations, parental or family leave, medical leave, all add to that, but you cannot go above that $100,000 cap or $20,833. Any retirement benefits also have to be included in that figure. So you just have to keep in mind there is a cap on how much you pay yourself. Other things that are included in payroll costs are your state unemployment insurance that is paid during the covered period or incurred during the covered period. And if you're self-employed, any of your net earnings from self-employment do count as payroll costs. So if you look at your Schedule C, you look at your line 31 on your Schedule C, you'll see what your net earnings are. It's pretty easy to find. So people want to know if and when they'll owe money, when their loan becomes due. So if you've used that loan amount for anything other than the things we just talked about, you will owe those funds back. And if any amounts are more than, if your payroll costs are not 60% or more, then you're going to owe money back on your loan. And the same thing with compensation levels. So you need to restore employees to their same hourly or salary levels by December 31st. But as I mentioned, there are safe harbors for full-time equivalent employees. So for instance, if you tried to hire back employees and they refused to come back because maybe they were getting unemployment and that was paying them more money, just make sure that you have in writing the offer for them to come back. So I want to talk about the basics of the payroll limits for owner employees, because I know this was a big question of, can I bonus myself? Is my health insurance included? Is my retirement plan included? Is my simple, is my, my SEP, are all these things included? So they have provided clarification, and after this, this workshop, I will send out a document that spells it out in great detail, and you can read through this. But just to give you the basics on this, if you are a sole proprietor, self-employed individual, so you file a Schedule C, you do not have a corporation, your forgiveness is limited to 2.5 divided by 12. So basically you need to pull out your Schedule C for 2019. You look at your line 31 and you do the math. Multiply by 2.5, divide by 12, and that's how much they're going to forgive. It's going to be a pretty easy calculation. The form is you can use the EZ form for forgiveness, and your health insurance unfortunately is not included if you are self-employed Schedule C filer. Same thing with your SEP IRA. If you are self-employed and you file a Schedule C, that also is not included as part of the forgiveness. So it is straight calculation off of your Schedule C. For S corporations, if you're an owner and employee of your S corporation, it's a little bit different. You will want to look to what you paid yourself in 2019. It's the same sort of calculation off of what you paid yourself for 2019. You're going to take 2.5 times your compensation, divide by 12, and that's how much they're going to include as part of your payroll costs. If you paid yourself and included your health insurance on your W-2, for 2019, my understanding is that counts as part of your compensation. So hopefully your payroll company included your health insurance in box 1 of your W-2 if you're an S corporation. For an S corp shareholder owner, you also can include as part of the forgiveness amount the state unemployment insurance, that's the SUI, that you paid during the covered period or incurred during your covered period. If you're making payments or contributions to your 401k during this period, during the covered period, that is also eligible to be counted for forgiveness. So you may want to check your payroll records, make sure that the reporting is being done correctly. Make sure as an S Corp shareholder owner that you're including that health insurance and the deferred compensation during your covered period in order for that to be counted. If you are a shareholder owner of a C corporation, also you want to pull up your 2019 compensation payroll reports and you do the same calculation. You're going to take that 2.5 divided by 12. For C corporations, your health insurance contributions are counted, I believe, no matter what, as are any retirement plan contributions, so long as they're paid or incurred during your covered period. State unemployment insurance, that's what you're paying to the EDD, that also can be included. So they did actually finally give us some clarification on that. And like I said, I do have a 12-page or 11-page article that I can send out from the SBA that gives you all of the details on this if you want to read up on it in more detail. So when you do request forgiveness, you will be submitting your request to your lender that's servicing your loan. So if you got your loan through Cabbage or Chase or Union Bank, make sure that you're reaching out directly to your lender and that you're not going through the SBA. You're going to want to include documents that verify the number of your employees and their pay rates. As I mentioned, that safe harbor for the full-time employee equivalent may apply to you. There are 2 safe harbors to the rule of hiring back employees, but the pay rate rule is still in place, so you must maintain the wage rate from the beginning of the year for all employees. You definitely are going to want to include copies of your lease agreements or closing disclosures for any buildings that you own if you're paying mortgage interest. You do want to include copies of all bills and payments, and then your lender still will have a 60-day period to make the decision about how much of your loan will be forgiven. So my tip for you is please, please, please check with your lender now. Many of the lenders have sent out emails, but you can actually contact them directly and ask them how much, when they'll be accepting applications and if they have any specific documents that they would like to see along with your forgiveness application. So some other clarifications and answers to questions that we had back in May were regarding costs paid and costs incurred. And so they have actually clarified as of August 11th, so a couple of days ago, that any costs that were incurred prior to your covered period actually will count towards the forgiveness as long as they're paid during your covered period. So if you had payroll that payroll checks didn't come until the covered period, but the costs were incurred prior to your covered period, those paychecks do count. Same thing with costs that are paid after the covered period. So if you pay your payroll after your covered period ends, but it was incurred during your covered period, then those count as well. So that was a huge win for us there. Another question that we had back in May quite a bit was does the interest on my credit cards count towards forgiveness? The answer is they are not eligible. So you need to not include that on your application. The interest on any sort of unsecured credit will not be eligible. So for instance, if you own a building, that would be secured interest. If you have a car loan, you can include the interest on your car loan, but not on the credit card. Another clarification that we received had to do with renewed leases, or if you refinance your mortgage during the covered period. And as long as you had a lease in place, or if you owned your building prior to February 15th, the lease payments or rent payments do count if you renew your lease during the covered period, and or if you refinance your mortgage, those interest payments do count as well. There were some questions about transportation expenses, and so we do have clarification on that. It does not pertain to auto expense. So transportation expenses in the CARES Act, they were actually talking about transportation utility charges. So please be sure not to include any auto expenses on your forgiveness application. So if you're feeling as overwhelmed as I am, this is probably what your office looks like often. So take a deep breath. And let's just talk a little bit more about what to gather. So my accounting tips, we kind of talked about this 3 or 4 months ago in a little bit of different light because people hadn't necessarily spent their PPP funds yet. So now we're actually gathering documents to achieve loan forgiveness. So these are the 5 tips that I have for you as you put together your application. So my first tip is hopefully everyone is using a payroll provider. And thankfully, Paychex, ADP, SurePayroll, Payroll Hub, I'm sure BBB have wonderful PPP reports available. If you have an online portal, make sure you're going into your online portal, check under the reports and or the COVID-19 tabs. I've already checked with my payroll provider and the reports are excellent. Just make sure you're just printing those out for your covered period. And including those along with your application. If you are not using a payroll provider, then you're going to want to gather your payroll reports yourself. So you're going to want your Form 941 for the 2nd quarter and most likely the 3rd quarter. You will want to print out payroll journals for each of your employees and include those with your application. If you're in California, you're going to want to include your DE9 and DE9C from the EDD. And if you live in different states, definitely check in with whatever Department of Revenue is responsible for payroll in your state. Keep in mind that 60% of the PPP loan needed to go to payroll costs over your 8-week or your 24-week covered period. Hopefully everybody caught that at the beginning when they received their PPP loan. So my second tip for you is to be sure you're utilizing your accounting software. You want to print out a profit and loss statement specifically for your covered period, so you can go into the settings in QuickBooks or in Xero, and you can print out a custom period. So make sure you're selecting just the dates that are in your covered period, so you can actually have a really good picture of exactly what you paid during that time period. You also want to drill down and print out the detail reports for each of the covered categories. So for instance, for your rent expense, you can print out that report and include it. You'll want to include your drill down and include your utilities and interest expense and so on. No more than 40% of your PPP funds can go to these non-payroll costs, so just make sure that you've accounted for this properly. Again, the covered expenses for non-payroll are mortgage loan interest, auto loan interest, rent and other lease payments, and utilities, which would be your gas and electric, water, trash, internet, they said is also includable in that category, and telephone. The third tip that I have for you is make sure you're tracking all of your funds. In addition to printing out the detail reports for each of your categories for eligible expenses and your payroll reports, make sure in your accounting software you're tagging those as PPP payments or disbursements, so that it's very, very clear that those were the funds that were used from your PPP loan. Start finding your corresponding receipts and bills that match your detail reports from your payroll software. Start doing that now. You don't want to wait until your 8 or 24-week period is over to do so. It will make you way too stressed out. And if you call your accountant, we're going to be having 150 people call us, and that will stress us out. So please, please help us, help you. So our fourth tip is, as I said before, as it pertains to owner compensation, so shareholder owners, make sure you're over documenting this. As we mentioned in an earlier slide, shareholder employees, you will need your 2019 and 2020 payroll records and tax filings. So utilize your payroll provider. They have great reports. Make sure you're getting all of those records in order now. Don't wait until the last minute to get those reports, because I believe that payroll companies will have their hands full getting people their payroll records. So you want to make sure you get those now. Again, like I said, for self-employed people, the process is going to be very simple for you. At least that's what they're claiming. This was very different than what they were telling us back in May. So just make sure that you find your Schedule C for 2019, print that out, and you're going to be submitting that along with your loan application. And they're saying that you should qualify for full forgiveness. I haven't seen that yet, but I'm hopeful that that is truly the case. For LLCs, if you're single member LLCs, you're going to be submitting the same documentation as a self-employed person, so Schedule C. If you're a multi-member LLC or a partnership, you're going to want to obtain your Schedule K1s and make sure you're looking to boxes 1 and 4A on those Schedule K1s, and you'll be including those with your application. My fifth tip, as I said, over document. If you've ever been to a tax audit, this is not necessarily the same thing, but keep in mind they're going to be forgiving a loan. So make sure you give them more than they want, and make sure that it's orderly, because they're not going to want to sift through a bunch of dog-eared receipts. So ordinary and necessary business expenses. So if the expenses are deductible on your Schedule C or on your 1120S or 1120, those are your tax returns. If you deducted these expenses in 2019, they should also qualify for the forgiveness for your PPP loan. So for instance, if you had utility expense in 2019, you had rent expense, and so on and so forth. Again, I would say first thing, mark a calendar what your covered period is, know when it started, know when it's ending, so that you know exactly what you're looking for in terms of expenses. Know the difference between payroll and non-payroll costs, and then gather documentation to prove those costs. For your payroll costs, you're going to want timesheets, you're going to want employee W-4s, payrolls, paycheck stubs, or in electronic payment receipts, all your payroll journals. The more you have to document that payroll, the better, and be sure to utilize your payroll provider. In terms of your non-payroll costs, you want to document both date and amounts. So make sure you're getting copies of your electronic payment receipts and checks for any expenses paid. Make sure you have a copy of your utility bills, any bank loan agreements, or rental lease agreements, or any lease agreements. You want to include those as well. And as I said, one of the big wins is that we don't actually have to print all these things out. You can compile it electronically and submit it all electronically. So my tip for you is please don't wait until the last minute to gather your documentation. You will be overwhelmed like that lady standing with all the papers falling all over her head. So just a little bit more information and updates about the PPP is, so they have said that the forgiveness of the PPP loan will be deemed, it's tax-free. But what they're fighting about right now has to do with, can I deduct the expenses from which I paid my PPP funds. So the IRS jumped in after the CARES Act was passed and stated that taxpayers may not deduct expenses that were paid by Paycheck Protection loans. Especially if the low payment of the loan resulted in loan forgiveness, which makes complete sense. And this stands as current law. So currently there's no deduction for expenses paid by the PPP debt if it's forgiven. However, they are fighting about it, and there may be a big change for this. So my advice is please just get your documentation together. Hold tight, because there is a possibility that you may also be able to deduct those expenses, which will simplify accounting. Everybody's going to jump up and down. It will also reduce your profit for the year, which means you're going to be paying less in taxes. So pray, cross your fingers, do whatever you do, that we actually not only will have forgiveness of the loan that will be tax-free, but that also you'll be able to write off your expenses. So again, wait to apply for PPP forgiveness, because we are hearing rumblings in the tax advisor community that if you actually apply for PPP forgiveness right now, and they say that you can't deduct your expenses, that you will, that law will apply to you, but then if they later change the law, that you will be able to deduct the expenses unless you've already been granted forgiveness. So there's just a lot of clarification that still needs to happen. Just a couple of other updates that people have been asking about. If you did receive the EIDL advance, that was that grant. So per employee was $1,000. If you were a sole proprietor, you received $1,000. This will be reducing your PPP loan forgiveness. So just to make it clear, for instance, if you received $40,000 PPP loan, $5,000 EIDL, for sure you're paying back the $5,000. Even if you spent the money on different things, they've made it fairly clear that you will have to pay back that advance if you get forgiveness on the PPP loan. So if the full amount of your loan is not forgiven, they have stated that your current lender must continue to service your loan. They've also stated that your lender must inform you when your first payment is due and how much that payment will be. So keep checking your email. Keep in mind, if you do not obtain forgiveness on your loan, you have to repay this either within 2 years or 5 years, depending on if you received your PPP funds before June 5th or not. So just to switch gears, Just a couple of other updates that people have been asking about. If you did have an SBA loan in place prior to the beginning of the year, and I believe through September of this year, the SBA is paying 6 monthly payments, interest and principal and all other charges for people that you did not have to apply for this, but after 6 payments, you will be responsible for paying back that SBA loan. Another provision that's been extended is the student loan payment relief. If you have student loans, you did not have to make those payments through September, but they've extended that through the end of the year, and interest is not accruing on those loans. I did want to bring to people's attention, there is an reopen business rally in Carlsbad tomorrow, August 15th, and I believe it's at the shops in Carlsbad. If you have any question about schools reopening, there's going to be some information there. All social distancing orders and health orders are being followed, so be sure that you bring your mask and wear your mask, and stay 6 feet apart from people who are not members of your same household. But this rally will be from 10 to noon, and I believe that our county supervisor, Jim Desmond, will be there as our keynote speaker. So that's tomorrow, August 15th at the shops, the East parking lot in Carlsbad. Just a bit more information about relief and other updates. The PUA, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, is still available through the end of the year. And unemployment benefits are also available. The additional $600 has now been expired, but a new program was passed, I believe this week, called the Assistance Program for Lost Wages. And so the benefits are $400 plus $167 per week through the end of the year, rather December 6th. You can apply for this relief if you are out of work, not receiving any other money, and you can get this relief for up to 26 weeks. You can still apply online. If you're in California, be sure you go to edd.ca.gov. For my Texan clients, you go to the twc.texas.gov. So stay tuned, things keep changing. A lot more relief is coming, I've heard, but nothing necessarily has passed yet. But we will be providing updates as things change. So the things that we recommend that you do right now are shore up your paperwork to make sure you're ready to apply, get it all together so you could just submit that application. Make sure you're using some sort of software and keeping formal books and records. We recommend using either QuickBooks Online or Desktop, QuickBooks Pro or Xero. There are a couple of other programs available, but those are 2 of the programs that we work with. Make sure that you're maintaining all your documents to show how your funding is spent, and make your plan for the remainder of 2020. One of the things you really want to keep in mind is you don't know yet if you will have forgiveness, so you don't know what your profit is going to be, so you're going to want to plan your estimated payments based on 2 different scenarios. One of the scenarios being you're able to deduct the expenses, and under the other expenses that you're not able to deduct those expenses. So your profit may be very low, maybe also higher. Second, make a personal and business spending plan for the rest of the year. We can help you do that. And make sure you breathe. These are interesting times. Make sure you're calling neighbors and friends, checking in with them. I have a few questions. If someone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, I am ready for your questions at this time. So I'll just start with the questions that I had from the chat. So first question is, for S-Corp owner employee, if health insurance shows up in the paycheck, then it is included. And the answer to that is yes. So you'll want to make sure that that is included. As a S-Corp shareholder owner, this is not subject to Social Security and Medicare, nor is it subject to any of the EDD employer taxes. So you may even want to just reach out to your payroll provider so that they are including it in your payroll reports, so that you know that it is showing up, so that is included. So my next question that we have is, I'm self-employed. I do not have a payroll service. I simply transfer money from my business account to my personal checking. I have paper from SDCCU that this transfers our payroll transfers. Will that be okay? So yes, that's absolutely okay. Sole proprietors, as I mentioned, I believe it's going to be so simple for you that you're really only going to be needing your 2019 Schedule C and not a lot of extra documentation. So any sort of backup for how you spent the money, I don't think you need to have receipts of how you spent it. The simple transfers to your personal account are enough, because they know that you're going to be spending that money to pay your bills as a sole proprietor. My next question, and it says a little off topic, but with regards to employee sick leave credit, is this a dollar for dollar credit for what is paid to employees during the 14-week period if they self-quarantine? Also, is that a credit that we claim and get part of a refund? So this will go through your payroll company. You want to make sure that you're reaching out to them. They can help you calculate this, and you'll be applying for this with your Form 941, is my understanding. And this documentation that you need to gather in order to qualify for the credit, just your simple, you know, the time cards and statements from your employees for that they needed to take the time off, is my understanding. Does anyone have any other questions for us? Please feel free, unmute yourself. I will stay on and answer as many questions as we have. Well, if no one has any more questions, I wish you all a fabulous Friday and a lovely weekend, and good luck with your PPP. If you'd like to schedule a one-on-one with us, please be sure you reach out to us to do so. One moment, we may have another question. Next question is, do payroll company fees count as utility or business fees? And the answer to that is you cannot count that towards forgiveness. I feel like I should tell you a tax joke at this time. I don't think I have one. Any other questions? So with that, do you know why they call your tax form a 1040? For every $10 you make, they say you owe 40. I hope you all have a great weekend. Thank you for being on the call this morning, and I will see you on our next Friday morning Q&A.